Well, I tell you what, there's a real daycare dilemma, I think, among a lot of parents. They want to know, do doctors think it is safe to send kids to daycare right now?
Well, that's a really good question. I think, the new data coming out is that we're having a surge in Texas right now and a lot of cases. And in Harris County, we're seeing more and more cases. We're starting to house adult patients at our pediatric hospital. And I think just that information alone makes parents a little bit hesitant to send their children to daycare. But of course, we have some parents who have to send their children to daycare. They are our doctors and nurses and our essential workers. And I think we're probably headed back towards a little bit of that limitation where maybe people who really need to go into the office should be using the daycares and then trying to keep those daycares as safe as possible.
There is a new survey out, Dr. Alana, that was pretty interesting, and it did find a low infection rate among children at daycares. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was a very informal survey, or unscientific survey, we should say, from Brown University. And it was during the primary pandemic that we saw in the New York City area, for example. And during that time, that they looked at 910 different daycares, about 20,000 children, and saw a very low infection rate, about 1% amongst staff and about 0.16% amongst children. And that's very reassuring. And then the child to adult transmission rate was also incredibly low. So one question we have is, well, if our child goes to daycare and then gets infected, are they going to come home and infect everyone else? And that probably still remains to be seen. And what I try to remind everyone is this is a very evolving process. The symptoms, the severity of the illness, everything has been evolving. And I think the data, even in the daycare centers, will be evolving. One of the concerns in Texas is that we've seen a kind of sharp rise in the number of children and staff who've been infected. So as of Tuesday, there were, I think, over 500,000 or 500, cases that were reported in daycares, and almost 200 of them were children. And so that in and of itself is a little bit concerning. It just depends on how many children we're talking about who potentially could get infected and how many adults as well.
Okay, so with that information, what kinds of questions should parents be asking their daycare providers before they choose to send them back or perhaps go to a new child care center?
Right. I think it's going to be hard to get into new child care centers. I think that is actually probably one of the problems right now is because, because of the crisis we're in. And so a lot of parents are kind of left with their current child care situation. So if you have to send your child to daycare, and I would advise only if you have to send your child to daycare to do so, then I would ask, are you following the CDC guidelines? So when Texas kind of backed off of the guidelines and opened up more daycares and then even opened up less restrictions, some daycares continue to follow the CDC guidelines. And I think that's very important. And so making sure the provider, of course, is wearing a mask. What's your cleaning protocol? What's the drop off and pickup procedure? So are we having adults go into the child care facility to drop off? It's much safer if the parent stays in the car. Even though they think it's easier for them, it's actually better for the daycare center if the parent remains in the car. Are they having shared meals? Are they having these children pod together so that they stay at least and only get exposed to a small group? And then how often are they hand washing? And then what happens if someone is exposed? So if there's a positive exposure at the daycare, what is the protocol in place? How long does the child have to stay home? And should the child be tested? Should they see their pediatrician and so forth? So I think understanding what each daycare's guidelines are will help.
And hopefully that will really help school districts too learn from these child care centers before they reopen in August. Dr. Alana, thanks so much for coming on Houston's Morning Show. Always good to see you.
All right, good to see you. Bye.